Hey church family, we just finished up Galatians number 9, focusing on chapter 4, verses 21 through 31. And this week, the big idea is that when we understand how we fit in God's story, then we know how to live our lives. Paul does something very interesting. He takes this historical, factual story of Abraham, and then he goes deeper into the story, showing us that there's a hidden meaning in the story, a spiritual meaning of how it really reveals and points to Jesus, that these two women, Hagar and Sarah, represent the two covenants, which really show us two ways we can live life. We can either live by works, trying to somehow gain the justification of God through our efforts, which never actually happens, or we can live by faith and receive the justification of God through this faith in Christ Jesus. And so what Paul is doing is he's showing you, look, this is where you fit in the story of God. You're a child of promise. You've received the gift of grace. You've received the gift of justification in faith in Christ. And so live that reality. Live the freedom, this life of freedom that you have in Christ. As I've reflected on this story, realize that the temptation for us is to really write a different story. Sometimes we forget I'm a part of God's story, and when that happens, we try to write our own story, which never goes well. In Abraham's case, him and Sarah decided that he should marry Hagar and have another child, and it just did not go well. It didn't work for them, and ultimately caused a lot of problems. And what we see is that you can have a godly motive and yet still respond in an ungodly way. And so from the time Abraham received the promise to the time that it was fulfilled, where he actually was given Isaac, that was 25 years within those 2 points in history. And what this has really taught me is that between when God gives you a promise and you actually see the fulfillment of that promise, that's the time of faith. God has given us a promise in Christ to grow and mature, but yet we won't see the completion of that until we see Jesus face to face. And so between now and then, that's the time of faith. And so I want to invite you and encourage you to remember you are a part of God's story, and within that story, Jesus is the hero, and the legacy that you've been given is a legacy of Christ. And this is really how this ties into our discipleship values. We don't live to ourselves. We don't live unto ourselves. We don't live for our own legacy. We live for Jesus and His legacy. So as you think about these things this week, I want you to think about, how are you tempted to write your own story? In what ways do you try to go off script and make it up as you go along doing life? And let that be a way to draw you back to God. Ultimately, we're not called to live self-sufficient life, but rather embrace a God-dependent life. And that's what I want for myself, that's what I want for you and our church, that we would be God-dependent in all that we are. Love you, have a good week.